Hello, everyone. Good to see you. How is everyone doing? Okay, good. Well, so a number of you have sent in your rough draft of the primary source paper. The final paper is actually due in a month, so you have plenty of time now to work on it. I have plenty of time to read it. And then, coming up then, we'll have a quiz on Thursday, and that's all I have to tell you. Any questions? Yes, Paul.
What did people send in? Did I miss something?
Yeah, a rough draft of their primary source paper.
When was that due?
Today. If for some reason you didn't get it in, not a big deal. Just send it in when you can. The purpose of this is not to, well, it's to make sure you're doing stuff. Okay, so that's really why you're doing this, and it's not. Writing is a process. You do some at a time, bit at a time, and rather than waiting until the papers due December 18th. So rather than waiting until December 17th to start it, I thought this would be a way to get you started earlier. I might have been a delusion on my part to think that it would work, but that's where we are. So, okay. I'm not going to be, my policy with this is not to punish the malefactors who don't get things in, but rather to reward those who do. And usually the reward comes in the fact that I can then give you enough guidance so that your finished product will be better. Okay, so that's that. Okay, does that answer your question, Paul?
Yeah, I'll talk to you after.
Okay, that's fine. I know people are in the middle of a lot of different things. So, okay, good. So another thing just to keep in mind, we've been talking about these different events that are very important in the formation of the Constitution. One thing we really can't lose sight of is the importance of context. That is the context of what's happening, because that often shapes the way people respond to specific events. And one of the big things happening in the early 1790s that really shapes the way people respond to political events is the French Revolution. Not the first time or the last time that some big international event shapes policies and politics in a country. It's happened, in your lifetimes, my lifetime, and so on. It happens here in the 1790s. 1789. I'm not. Some of you may know the French Revolution better than I do. Anyone have strong feelings about the French Revolution here, or is this the first time you've heard that there was, in fact, a revolution in France once upon a time? It's okay if it's news to you. In fact, I kind of welcome that. I welcome finding out that here's something I can actually teach you. Anyone have any thoughts on the French Revolution? Good thing, bad thing? Yeah, I suspect. Yes, Paul.
Yeah, so I think that the ideals expressed in the French Revolution was a really good thing, and like them trying to copy the American Revolution and overthrow the monarchy. I think the way they went about it was very poor, and it led to the collapse that eventually restored the monarchy.
Okay. So you're saying, yeah, good. What were the basic Trevor saying? It wasn't a great one as far as revolutions go. And by the way, I think if I were French, I would insist that the French don't copy anyone else. So they didn't copy the American Revolution. They would see a different kind of impact of the American Revolution had on France, that is causing the bankruptcy of the French monarchy, which leads then to higher taxes and budget crisis, and of course bad harvests lead to starvation, and so you have all these inherent problems in France, then leading to revolution in 1789, and it's unclear at that moment what path the revolution would take. Among those in France at the time were Thomas Jefferson, the American minister to France, who is very enthusiastic about France changing its system. And Lafayette is someone also very enthusiastic about France reforming the monarchy. Instead of the king having absolute power, you would have a constitutional monarchy with an assembly that would represent the different interests in France. And this all would lead to France not having such an arbitrary government. You may recall that our friend Montesquieu was kind of proposing a similar thing back in the 1740s, 1750s. It didn't get anywhere with that particular line of endeavor. So another of the folks we've talked about, or we should be familiar with, who's in France at the time, of course, is Thomas Paine, author of Common Sense. And he's elected to the French Assembly. And a series of events happen in France in, well, we don't need to get into the play-by-play. By the way, I started to ask a few minutes ago before I got distracted by the sound of my own voice and wanting just to keep talking, that what were the three organizing ideas or the three concepts? Paul mentioned the French having good ideas. There were three words they used to explain what it was the revolution was all about. Okay. Liberty, equality, and fraternity. So fraternity meaning brotherhood. It didn't mean they wanted to join, Sigma Chi and put on togas and do the other things, but fraternity, brotherhood. So is there anyone among this particular class who is against liberty, equality, and brotherhood? And no one at least wants to admit it, that they have doubts about one of the, so yeah, good things. And we Americans kind of also like these things, who could possibly object to them? And so when the revolution begins, as I said, Jefferson's quite enthusiastic about it, and he sees ushering in this new era, and then other Americans are as well. And Americans actually do start, some Americans start kind of copying some of the things that the French are doing. For example, one of the leading forces in the French Revolution were these coffee houses where people would get together and talk politics. And they called them little societies Jacobin Societies because they were Jacobin clubs. This all has to do with Jacob being the Latin for James, and a complicated story about why they have these kind of gathering places and places where people can talk ideas. You form a political club, you get together every night, every week, and talk politics, and it's all very exciting. So this is what's going on in France. And so Americans start doing this as well. They form their clubs, their little societies that meet and talk about political issues and what kinds of things we should be doing and ways we could encourage government action on certain things, but above all, really liking liberty, equality, fraternity. And by the way, these clubs are primarily men. And one thing men like to do when they get together in groups would be to, in this period, men don't do this anymore, is they would drink toasts. And, you would come up with, so we would start off, Paul would give a toast and usually just a few words like liberty. And then he would explain why he liked liberty. And we would all drink to this. It's all men. So then Giovan would get up and he would give his toast to equality and explain, what he liked about equality. And then, and someone would be writing all of this down too. So your toasts, and then Mitchell's turn, he would give his toast, then Trevor, and then let's see, we're almost out of men that I'm seeing on my screen, but I know there are more here. James would give one, Jeffrey would give one. Maybe someone would propose letting the women in so that they could also give toasts. And and this would go around until everyone had given a toast. And then what we would do is run down the next day, take this to a local printer who would then print this in the newspaper saying, the little society met, and these were the toasts given, the different sentiments given. So then this spreads. The next club in the next town would do a similar thing. They would give toasts and all. It sounds like kind of an entertaining thing to do. And some of you might want to think about this as a way of passing the time, giving toasts. Now, of course, not with alcohol. I suspect that by the end of these, people would lose sight of what had already been toasted. By the way, toasting used to be a much more common thing. Today, the only time it's really done is at weddings, and you've probably heard, a best man or maid of honor give some long, elaborate, meaningless toast about what this wonderful couple. If people had more practice doing this, wedding toasts would be a lot more eloquent and interesting. So maybe we should revive this just for the sake of those of us who attend weddings, and we'll have some more meaningful experience. If you're ever called upon to do this, you'll kind of know what to do. So anyway, this is what it sounds. All this sounds fairly innocuous here. People are giving toasts and publishing in the newspapers the toasts they're giving, and it's a nice way of getting together with friends who will share similar political ideas and being part of one big happy family. Now, the thing is, as Paul indicated, I think Trevor's comment indicated, there is some trouble on the horizon in the French Revolution. We don't really know that. What we do know is France has this despotic government. Now they're getting rid of the despotic government, forming a new one. And that seems to be very much something we like. It is something very much we like, at least in the 1790s. Don't like despotic governments. And if the French are getting rid of theirs, creating something new, all the better. It's extending the sphere of liberty. One person, by the way, who is not entirely down with all of this is John Adams. And you'll recall the last time we saw John Adams, he was proposing that the president have a long, elaborate title. He's wearing a ceremonial sword to his duties as vice president, and other ways making himself completely ridiculous in the American political sphere. And the Senate doesn't have a whole lot to do because the real action is in the House of Representatives, and this leaves Adams with time on his hands. And when John Adams had time on his hands, that generally was a bad thing. And so he is taking this opportunity to think about what's happening in France, and Adams doesn't think France is going to come to a good end, because what the French are doing, Adams says, is destroying the only government they've ever had and replacing it with something they're kind of making up as they go along. This isn't going to work out well, because what France was trying to do by essentially abolishing the power of the monarch is instead diffusing power all over the place. And what will happen, Adams said, is France is going to have a period of anarchy, and it may seem really liberating. Bad old regime is gone. Now we can create the new one. And Adams said that's really not going to work, because what is going to happen is some military dictator is going to come along and take this chaos and from it create a new state with centralized power. Power is not simply going to go away or be diffused for long. It's going to be centralized. So Adams is saying France is headed for trouble. And he's not, by the way, not making this up out of the whole cloth. He's reading history. And back in the 14th century, there had been a series of civil wars in France and a period of chaos. And what emerged out of that wasn't a period of diffused power where we don't have some strong man, but instead some strong man comes along, centralizes power, and that's an end to this brief moment of liberty. And by the way, there's a 15th century Italian historian named Davila who had written about this back in the 15th century. This is how Adams knows it. He's reading the Italian historian Davila, who is writing about the French Revolution. And Adams warns that you're not going to be able to sustain this democracy in France because France isn't used to democracy. France is used to having despotic rule by the monarch and this aristocracy holding everything in check. You get rid of all of those restraints, And yeah, the democracy ultimately is going to turn into a dictatorship, probably worse than the one you already have. So Adams starts publishing a series of essays he calls Discourses on Davila. What could seem more innocuous than someone writing about an historian who had written 3 centuries earlier, talking about things that happened in a faraway country? But of course, Adams is talking about France. And when these newspaper articles start appearing, folks in those Democratic Republican societies, that's what they called the little debating clubs they had started here, read them and are outraged because John Adams is saying the French Revolution won't work. It's going to end in military dictatorship. So who does this guy think he is, coming out against the French Revolution? We like the French Revolution. And so what happens almost immediately is we go from toasting at our Democratic Republican meeting to going down to the printing office and demanding breaking in, smashing the press, or demanding that the publisher stop printing this stuff, or we will smash the press, because we don't think John Adams should be criticizing the French Revolution. Now, does anyone here think John Adams should be criticizing the French Revolution, saying it's headed for trouble, or do we believe in, or do we not believe in liberty, equality, fraternity? No one wants to. Okay, Lindsay definitely believes in those three. So, Lindsay, do you want John Adams to be saying the French Revolution is going to end in disaster? Speaking for yourself or anyone else? Yes, Paul.
So I think Adams' cautious approach, in hindsight at least, is a good approach, because as we've seen, it does pretty much follow the train of thought that he outlines. But at the time, it's kind of hypocritical of Adams to criticize a revolution when he supported and backed the revolution. I know the circumstances are different, where the French had a despotic absolute monarchy, whereas the colonies had assemblies and stuff. But it seems kind of hypocritical to be like, you shouldn't value these and you should just live under your crappy government just because you can't do it without it. But in hindsight, yeah, I think he makes a good point.
Okay, I know you also raise a very good point too, that Adams had been part of the American Revolution. Now he's saying the French can't have a revolution because, well, he's saying because, and Adams would say the American Revolution came out of the experience of the American people. And okay, Lindsay has another comment. Yeah, trends in that Adams knew where the American Revolution had originated. And it wasn't simply, well, in Massachusetts, it really was about not changing the system of government, about keeping the charter government, which had been our experience, the experience of the people here. And in France, what they're doing is removing the only government with which they've had any experience and replacing it with something which they hadn't. Not to say they can't learn. By the way, it's an argument Adams is making that may be certainly more sophisticated than those folks who show up at the printing office wanting to smash the press or ready to argue about. Usually if you show up someplace wanting to smash something, it's not because you're looking for more nuance in an argument. So, by the way, someone else who had supported the American Revolution comes to the same conclusion. This is Edmund Burke. And Burke, member of parliament, great orator, great thinker, comes to see that the revolution in France is really going to turn out badly. And he had supported the American Revolution. He thought that the Americans were rebelling against the British Parliament and Crown as a way of protecting the kinds of governing systems they already had. And a government, Burke says, has to emerge out of the experience of a people. You can't simply say, okay, this is the kind of government any country should have, because countries have different societies. France, Burke said, is different from England. It has a monarchy. It has an absolute monarch, but it also has an established church, and it has an aristocracy. And these are institutions of long standing, and you can't simply eliminate them as the French are doing and then say, okay, now everything is going to be fine. Instead, what you're going to have is chaos and disaster. So Burke wrote a book called Reflections on the Revolution in France. He doesn't read John Adams. I mean, no one in England is sitting around saying, boy, I wonder what someone in America has to say about this. People in England are able to write their own books, which Burke does. You know, Reflections on the Revolution in France is really a warning about what happens when you discard a government, the only government under which the French people have had any experience, and simply try to replace it with something new that doesn't have any connection with the social experiences of the people of France. And so Burke's Reflections on the Revolution in France, like Adams's discourses on Davila, is a warning about what is going to happen in France as France abolishes its government and tries to institute a democracy. Burke's not against democracy, but he doesn't think a democracy is going to work in every country if people don't have any experience in it. By the way, most Americans are also uncomfortable with the idea of democracy. Today, we throw the word around as though it's the only ideal. But, you know, the United States has a republican system, and it does have, you know, we don't have social orders the way they do in France, but we do have a division of power. So Burke says the French government comes out of the social divisions in France, and any government has to take some cognizance of that fact. Again, more nuanced argument than you might want if you're heading down to smash the printing press or parading in the streets because you don't like the way things are going. So you have Burke writing his Reflections on the Revolution in France, and that provokes a reaction in France. And the reaction comes from France's foremost, the foremost member, the member of the French Assembly most able to counter an argument from an English writer, and that is Thomas Paine. And Thomas Paine writes a response to Edmund Burke, which is called A Vindication of the Rights of Man. The French, Paine says, can start whatever kind of government they want, no matter what Edmund Burke thinks about it. The people have this fundamental right to decide how they will be governed. And that's what the French are doing at this moment. They're throwing out the old government, creating a new one, using their best lights to do this, well, no matter what either the French monarchy, aristocracy, church, or Edmund Burke have to say about it. People have a fundamental right to govern themselves. By the way, does anyone here dispute that? I'm not going to call on Paul to see if he disputes whether people have a fundamental right to govern themselves. So far, he's the only one other than Lindsay venturing an opinion on all of this. Trevor grew strangely quiet after saying the French Revolution wasn't a great one. Are we Burkeans or are we Paineites here? And by the way, in reaction to Paine, Mary Wollstonecraft wrote a pamphlet called A Vindication of the Rights of Women, which raises another series of issues, which we don't, we probably should talk about it, but I'm sorry not to be prepared to talk about the vindication of the rights of women right now. Who's right, Edmund Burke or Thomas Paine? Yes, Trevor.
I would say Burke. So I feel like the violence of the French Revolution and the instability of it all made it not so great.
Okay, the thing to remember here too, by the way, you put that very well. We know, Paul knows, and anyone who's thought about it knows, the French Revolution does turn out badly for the French, and it does end the way Adams says with a military dictatorship. After we've cut off the heads of aristocrats, priests, etc., and fought a war against all of Europe. The French Revolution ends badly. Okay. So we kind of know that, which is kind of unfortunate for us, because then we can't really think, what would we have thought in 1790 when we are saying we like liberty, equality, and fraternity, and then we have these pompous, John Adams, Edmund Burke saying, oh no, big mistake, not going to turn out well. How do they know? We know we support the rights of man, the liberty, equality, fraternity, the right of people to form their own governments. And these guys are just a bunch of killjoys who don't want people to govern themselves. And which is why we're heading down to the printing office to smash the press, because we don't like the fact that we don't like Adam saying he doesn't like the French Revolution. So it's, we kind of have to understand it. We need to suspend a little bit our knowledge of what happens, which is probably going to make more of us Burkeans than Painites. I'm really hoping to hear from some Painites here. I don't know, maybe they're not signing up for my classes anymore because they figured out that I'm no longer a Painite. I was at one time, but when I was your age, I loved Thomas Paine. But this isn't about me. It's about you, and it's about Paine and Burke and the Constitution. So, and no one else wants to speak up for Thomas Paine other than most people in 1790 who were reading this in America were supporting Paine as opposed to Burke and Adams. I'll tell you what happens here. And this will give you time to think, or maybe type in your comments, or maybe there's some way we can anonymously contribute what we say, for fear I'm going to get together a mob of Burkeans. Paul, Trevor, and me are going to go smash up your printing presses if you're Painites, which would be an odd thing, because Burkeans typically don't go around destroying property. At least the Burkeans I hang out with. Anyway, getting back to this. Paine writes his Vindication of the Rights of Man. He has to send it to England to get printed. He can't go to England himself because he's under indictment. He'll be arrested if he goes there. And not to foreshadow this too much, Paine does wind up imprisoned in France because the revolution, as Trevor and Paul will have predicted, take a turn where if you're not far, by the way, this is also where we get the ideas of right and left for political polarities, because the more radical members of the assembly sit on the left side and the more conservative ones sit on the right side. So you have lots of things coming out of the French Revolution that we still enjoy today. So, and one of them is a polarization of political opinions. So anyway, Paine's book, bestseller in England and in France, and then a copy of it arrives in America, actually sent to John Beckley, who is the clerk of the House of Representatives. And Beckley is a political functionary. He is somehow connected to James Madison, who got Beckley the post of being clerk to the House of Representatives. Beckley gets a copy of Paine's Rights of Man, and Madison says, oh, I'd really like to read that. So Beckley had gotten the book because he was going to have it printed. A publisher in Philadelphia wanted to bring out an American edition of this. In order to do that, he actually needs a physical copy of it. And John Beckley has one. And then John Beckley loans it to James Madison. So Madison is reading The Rights of Man. And he mentions this to Thomas Jefferson. And Jefferson says, well, I'd like to read that too. So Madison says, okay, I can loan it to you, but I'm leaving town and I'm supposed to give it to Mr. Beckley so that he can bring it to the printer. And Jefferson says, well, I can give it to Beckley. And Madison says, well, there's another problem. Beckley's also leaving town. So Jefferson says, well, then I'll get it to the printer once I'm done reading it. And Jefferson, being a very responsible guy, does that. He reads the book and then he sends it off to Mr. Smith, the printer. Now, he thinks Smith might wonder, how come I'm getting a copy of this book from Thomas Jefferson, who is Secretary of State and whom I've never met? And so Jefferson writes a little note explaining why Smith is getting the book from Jefferson, not from Beckley. Simple enough note. Any of us could write it. Mr. Beckley loaned this book to Mr. Madison, who loaned it to me, and now I'm sending it to you. It's all you need to say. But Jefferson was not someone who could let something rest with all he needed to say. He thought he needed to say something else. So he says, I am happy to see that it will be reprinted here, where it will do a lot of good. I know that I have the exact wording here. I am extremely pleased to find it will be reprinted here, and that something is at length to be publicly said against the political heresies which have sprung up among us. I have no doubt our citizens will rally a second time to the standard of common sense. Common sense, of course, had been Paine's pseudonym back when he wrote Common Sense. And here Jefferson is saying our citizens will rally a second time to the standard of common sense. And of course, also, Paine is saying something publicly against the political heresies which have sprung up among us. What do you think those political heresies might be? Paul, it looks like you're about to weigh in.
John Adams criticizing the revolution.
It could very well be John Adams. Trevor, was that what you had in mind or something else? Yeah. Well, okay. So I should tell you that Smith didn't know Jefferson, but he did know something about selling books. And here he has gotten what today we would call a blurb. Okay. It's not any blurb. It's a blurb from the Secretary of State saying, I am extremely pleased to find this book is going to be reprinted here, and that it will say something about these political heresies which have sprung up among us. So this letter from the Secretary of State, whom we now know is also the author of the Declaration of Independence, appears on the front page of this book, Paine's book, when it's reprinted here. Yeah, this is one of the greatest blurbs in publishing history. And it also leads us to wonder, well, what heresies does he have in mind? And what happens next is the newspapers that had stopped printing Adams's discourses on Davila now start printing them again, column by column, with comments with the rights of man, showing how Paine is refuting John Adams's arguments, which, of course, Adams didn't have Paine in mind when he was writing them, and Paine didn't have Adams in mind. Paine was responding to Edmund Burke, but that's close enough. He's also responding to the whole idea that the French can't form their own government. So this is major political context here, because we have the French Revolution, which is coloring the way we think about everything. And whether we believe in liberty, equality, fraternity, or the right of the people to form their own governments, or whether we think people who form their own governments need to be really careful when they do it, or they're going to lead to chaos. And it's quite clear, Burke is saying, you have to be really careful, going to lead to chaos. And usually the government you're creating is going to be worse than the one you're overthrowing. And then Paine saying that people have a right to form whatever government they want, whether Edmund Burke or John Adams approves. So, of course, it's very embarrassing for John Adams now to be called a political heretic by Thomas Jefferson, whom Adams had thought was they always agreed on things. I mean, both of them had been in Europe at the same time. Both of them, it was Adams who suggested Jefferson to write the Declaration of Independence. And now Jefferson's calling him a heretic. And it's also, I should say, very embarrassing for President Washington, because here he has the Secretary of State and the Vice President arguing publicly, one calling the other a heretic. This is really a fraught time. And of course, the Democratic Republicans are, of course, toasting Paine and toasting Jefferson, and of course, condemned. By the way, in the 1790s, two holidays emerge that people celebrate. And people depending on your political outlook, you are going to celebrate one more than the other. The two big holidays are February 22nd and July 4th. And these two dates seem to have different meanings. What's February 22nd? I know it's been generations since February 22nd itself was a holiday. Anyone know what it is? Yes, Trevor.
Is it Washington's birthday?
It is, in fact, Washington's birthday. Yes, and of course, supporters of Washington, friends of Washington, and people who like Washington and like having a stable government and admire what Washington did with the Continental Army observe February 22nd. And if you think, gee, in England, the king's birthday is a holiday, you'll think maybe it's not such a good idea. The same folks who are celebrating Washington's birthday also wanted to put a throne up in the Capitol, in the House of Representatives chamber, so people could address that, and talked about his most gracious speech and so on. And the other day is July 4th, which is, of course, Independence Day. And one thing that becomes a central feature of Independence Day is reading the Declaration of Independence. You'll recall John Adams had thought July 2nd would be the big day. That was the day Congress actually declared independence, but the day becomes July 4th, the day Congress adopted the Declaration. So you have these two kind of different holidays emerging. It's hard for us to imagine a time when people were so divided politically, they couldn't even agree on the same holiday. And it's fortunate that now we live in a time where everyone gets along and basically thinks, you may disagree slightly, but that's okay. You're entitled to your opinion. Different time in the 1790s, okay? And so Washington isn't happy about any of this, but of course, it's not all about Washington. There are other things happening. This is kind of the big sideshow, but it really colors the way we're thinking about the nature of political society and the nature of society itself, and whether people have the power to change their government. So what begins to happen in the 1790s is this. I mean, the Democratic Republican societies really want to be able to do what Paine had said 30 years earlier, start the world anew, 20 years earlier. We have it in our power to begin the world over again. Okay. And there is a fear here that with the establishment of this strong central government, we won't have that ability. So among the Democratic Republicans, there is a certain fear that the Washington administration's idea is simply to stop letting us govern ourselves and instead create a system like England or like France before the Revolution. That's kind of one worry among some of the Democratic Republicans. Among the Federalists, that is the supporters of the Washington administration, there is also a worry. Is the end of the Democratic Republicans simply being part of a democratic republic, or is it the abolition of all government? Because that's what we see happening in France. And the more these characters trumpet the French Revolution as being the great moment of human history, the more we worry that their end really is to abolish all government. And by 1793, a couple of things have happened that are very important in terms of the French Revolution. One is France's declaration of war against England. And of course, the United States, having fought a war against England, wasn't really a big supporter of England. On the other hand, most of our trade is with England. But then also, in 1793, the French arrest the king and put him on trial and ultimately execute him. And so is that really what the revolution is leading toward? Not just, hey, let's limit the powers of the monarch, but let's actually cut off the monarch's head and abolish the monarchy itself. And what kind of constraints will there be in France? So you have, this may seem like a far-fetched worry, but one thing that happens in America is you have in 1793, actually in 1791, Congress had passed an excise tax on whiskey. This is all part of Hamilton's plan for financing the assumption of the debts from the Revolutionary War. And Hamilton's reasoning was, you already have a tariff on imports. Merchants on the Eastern Seaboard are paying this tax, and merchants on the Eastern Seaboard already support the new federal government. What you want to do is make sure people on the frontier also are engaged with the federal government. And the way to do that is to have them help to pay to support it by taxing whiskey. And whiskey, of course, made with corn, difficult to ship corn if you want to get it to market. It's a lot easier to ship corn if you have turned it into gallons of whiskey. And so in 1791, Congress passes an excise tax on whiskey, which does require sending out collectors to the frontier, to places like Pittsburgh or the frontier of Virginia, to see if people have stills and how much whiskey they are producing. The idea here is a still. I don't know if any of you is familiar with the process of turning corn into whiskey. No one is. Okay, so there are a number of things you can do with corn to make it sellable. One, you can sell ears of corn. They're not going to keep for very long. You can turn the corn into flour, corn flour, which is not as fine as wheat flour, less of a market for it, but there is a market for corn flour. Or you can feed it to hogs. And hogs you can move around, okay, and get them to market. You know, if Haley shows up with a ton of corn and starts asking if anyone wants to buy it, you're probably not going to get a whole lot of takers. If she has fed her corn to hogs, let's say she has 10 hogs, probably going to be easier to sell 10 hogs than a ton of corn. And it's probably going to be a lot easier for you to ship, to get, you know, hogs can walk, corn can't. So there's that advantage in the hogs. Or you can turn a ton of corn into, say, 5 gallons of whiskey, and you can carry those around quite easily. And each gallon jug you could sell separately. And you make more on that than you could for the ton of corn. Of course, you put in something into producing, turning the corn into whiskey. That is, you had to invest in a still. And the process of distilling it requires you mash the corn and you turn it into this mash, you distill it, and then you get this refined product of whiskey. I mean, sour mash is a byproduct you would have gotten along the way. And those who are more anxious to get at it will drink the sour mash. But what you want is the more refined whiskey. And whiskey keeps, unlike corn and unlike hogs. Even flour might go bad or may get weevils in it. So you have something that can keep. So you have a still that can turn a ton of corn into 5 gallons of whiskey. Of course, it takes maybe 2 weeks to do that. But that means over the course of a year, you could turn out, okay, 25 times 5 is how much whiskey? 125 gallons of whiskey. I was able to do that simple arithmetic problem myself. So should Haley, by the way, Haley, how much whiskey are you producing in a year?
Well, you said 125.
That's how much you can produce, okay? So should we tax you according to how much you can produce or according to how much you do produce?
How much I do produce.
Okay, good. So when Jovan is the inspector, he shows up and he says, okay, you can make 125 gallons of whiskey a year. How much do you make? What are you going to say?
I'll probably say that I made less than that, so I don't get taxed as much.
Sure. Well, how much less? I'm going to say.
I'll say I made 100.
Well, you really are an honest person. I would have said, I mean, I don't know if anyone else would have said this. I just have this still to turn my own corn into whiskey, and I only produce about a ton of corn a year. So I produce about 5 gallons a year. Jovan, the inspector, says, you know, you're probably not every neighbor doesn't have a still. So you're probably making whiskey for all of your neighbors, which means, by the way, the first thing he has to do is get onto your property, and you're the honest one that you've let onto your property. Mitchell had a shotgun ready to keep Jovan off of his property because he doesn't think the collector should be coming onto my property at all to see my still. We keep our stills out in the woods where the Jovan can't find them. So Jovan wants you to pay a tax on all the whiskey you can produce, knowing that's probably what you're producing. You want to pay less. You'll say 100. By the way, Jovan, are you happy that she said 100 gallons and that's how much you'll tax her? Finally, you found.
Sorry, I'm bad at buttons. I'd be pretty happy with 100. I doubt she's actually spending every week making whiskey. So 100's pretty good for me. I'm glad to take that.
Okay, yeah. Because Mitchell said his still doesn't even work anymore, and he's not producing any whiskey. And so what's happening here? Jovan's going around the countryside trying to inspect stills to see what the capacity is, and people aren't letting him onto their land. And more than that, in Western Pennsylvania and in Western Massachusetts and upstate New York and in Kentucky, by the way, I should have mentioned Kentucky earlier when we're talking about whiskey, but or anyone who's in, those of you who may be fans of it, there's mobbing the collectors. They're setting up liberty poles, by the way, something they did during the American Revolution, but also something the French are doing. And there's even a plot to burn Pittsburgh, which is the central town out on the frontier, because that's where these collectors are coming from. So what you have essentially in the West, as these customs agents go out to try to collect this tax, is civil war breaking out. And what should the Washington administration do when the I'm sorry, I keep calling them customs collectors, excise tax collectors are out on the frontier getting attacked by mobs who are setting up liberty poles saying, we don't want any of this. Would you, as the Washington administration, take any position on this? Say, well, they're within the rights to protest this. We can understand hard feelings out on the frontier. Giovanni, are you trying to talk?
I'm sort of trying to. My Zoom kind of just broke. I don't know what's going on. So, yeah, if I was the Washington administration, and I'm trying to get these taxes, I probably wouldn't accept it. I'd be pretty upset. I don't think I'd send the military out there.
So you wouldn't. Okay. Well, what would you do?
Well, I'd probably write to the governors of those states and say, hey, your people aren't obeying the law. You should make them. Okay. I feel like it's too much to have the federal government go to every state and every frontier and say, hey, you have to do this. I think it might be easier to do it at a state level. Okay. Then you're having states collect taxes for the federal government, which. Okay.
Well, that's kind of the problem, though, because the governors of the state say, we don't like the tax either. And, in fact, the governor of Pennsylvania is really very much against the tax. And he says, yeah, back in 1789, you were saying that the federal government would never impose an excise tax. And now here it is. And it's falling on the citizens of my state. No, I'm not going to collect the tax for the federal government. It's up to you to do it. Ideally, I suppose, if you wanted to get the tax collected, that's what you would do. But I don't know that the Washington administration sees much of a choice here. Washington also worries, is this a general breakdown in support for government as a whole? That is the fact that now people can choose what laws they obey and not. And here, Congress passed the law, and even members of Congress from Pennsylvania voted for the law. And once Congress does that, it's the law. And once the president signed it, it's the law, and people should obey the law, or else you really don't have a government. Yeah, it's not, you wouldn't want to use military force necessarily, but on the other hand, you've already sent out the civilian agents, the tax collector, and people are threatening to tar and feather him, and they're threatening to burn down Pittsburgh. And is this a rebellion, or is it just people protesting? I mean, it's a pretty serious question as this is happening in 1792 and 93. And I know someone is going to bring up the fact that back in the 1760s and 1770s, the British government imposed taxes that were unpopular here, and people did very similar things, setting up liberty poles, threatening to tar and feather the collectors. In fact, here in Boston, they tore down Andrew Oliver's warehouse on Long Wharf. But the difference is no one here had voted for the British government, but here Americans had elected this government, which then has the constitutional power to impose taxes. And Congress has done this. And now people are protesting and say, we're not going to obey the law. Well, how do you get them to obey the law? I mean, it seems like your options are a little limited here. What happens is well, a number of things happen in the meantime. Jefferson left office by this time. Washington's reelected in 1792, actually reelected unanimously. And in 1794, as there are these protests on the frontier, Washington declares that the laws are broken down in Western Pennsylvania. And he'll raise a 12,000-man army to go west to put down the rebellion. By the way, the rebellion had done a lot of threatening to burn down Pittsburgh, set up liberty poles, tar and feather people, but it really hadn't done anything else. There had been elections in 1794 that returned to office, some people who were opposed to the excise tax, others who were not. Washington really, or I should say Hamilton, really wants to use military force or send a military force to Western Pennsylvania. Because Hamilton, as you know from the play, really enjoys putting on a uniform and looking really dashing. And he leads this 12,000-man army across Pennsylvania in the summer of 1794 to put down a rebellion, which really wasn't happening. So you have an army going out to Western Pennsylvania where there's really nothing happening other than, people were upset with the excise tax. They're not actually burning Pittsburgh or tarring and feathering the tax collectors, but it's still a worrying thing for the Washington administration. And so the use of military force, Jovan had thought it might be an overreaction, and it might have been. But what Washington is doing by sending the army isn't just giving Hamilton a chance to put on a uniform and maybe come up with a couple of new songs that they can use in the musical. But what he's really doing is showing that the federal government can enforce the law, even in places that don't want the law to be enforced. And what Washington really sees in this isn't people upset with a law they passed, but something that's going to lead to the complete breakdown of the established order. I mean, if people are not going to obey the excise law, what law will they obey? What kind of authority will there be? So anyway, long, convoluted way of putting all of this rebellion over whiskey as the federal government imposes this excise tax, and it leads to an insurrection in Western Pennsylvania that ultimately dies out as cooler heads prevail among those who don't like the excise tax, saying we should work within the system and get the law repealed rather than burning down Pittsburgh. And also a couple of other things happening on the frontier, one being the problems with the native people in Ohio, as the United States had been fighting a war on the frontier in what's now Ohio against the various native people, and hadn't gone very well, suffice it to say. Anyway, where were we with this? Anyway, in the wake of this, and as you know, the whole thing does end, so I don't need to belabor the point. In his annual message at the end of 1794, President Washington talks about what had happened, this emergence from this potentially disastrous rebellion. And it might look like the Federalists or the government overreacted by suppressing the insurrection with force. But on the other hand, the administration saw the consequences in France of letting the established order break down. And they fear this might happen on the frontier. And Washington, in his annual message, he calls for a day of prayer and fasting as a way of atoning for these problems, but also he praises the American people for having come through this crisis without destroying their constitutional system. And he also says things would have been a lot easier if you didn't have these self-created societies, he called them, where people get together and talk about political issues and complain about government policy, and they really exacerbated the problem. That is, you had a government trying to respond to a crisis, but instead of letting the government do its job, which is to govern, you had these democratic Republican societies talking about how the federal government is trying to be as overpowering as the French monarchy. And Washington saw these self-created societies as really a bad thing. Are self-created societies a bad thing? Maybe Washington should have come down a little harder on the self-created societies. I don't know, anyone here have thoughts on self-created societies? Good thing, bad thing? This sounds like a good quiz question. Where do you stand on self-created societies? By the way, there's another little episode that illustrates this. Well, Washington, by the way, I'll get to this in a minute. What Washington sees is that the American people have elected Congress and have elected him. No one's elected these self-created societies, the Democratic Republicans who are gassing on about what the people want. Well, if the people really want something, at the next election, they'll vote for these folks. But you only have one government at a time. So Washington is trying to preserve this constitutional order, and he sees the self-created Democratic Republican societies as trying to undermine it. Any questions on this? Any thoughts on this? Any counter opinions? See, a number of screens have gone dark. Perhaps people have joined self-created societies and they're off harping about needing to take control of the class because you have this despotic power that won't stop talking. And what you need to do is rise up and establish liberty, equality, fraternity. My Zooms also seems to be doing strange things. So anyway, why should you have self-created societies when you've already elected a government to govern? Shouldn't you just get out of its way and let it do what it was elected to do?
Professor, can you see our hands?
I cannot. All I can see right now are you, Paul Haley. I see Melissa Wong and Kelly Ortiz's names, but I don't see hands. So something is happening here, and I don't know what it is.
Yeah, my Zoom freaked out earlier. I don't know what's going on.
Okay.
But it kind of broke.
Okay. I am recording this, which is a good thing. So did you have something to say, Jaman?
Yeah. Me, Paul, and Mitchell, or Paul, Mitchell, and I have raised our hands.
Okay.
I kind of
Good.
can you repeat the question? Sorry, I lost my train of thought.
Self-created societies, good thing, bad thing? When we elect
Oh.
a government, should we get out of its way and let it govern? Or should we keep harping about what we want it to do?
For that, I think if you're going to elect a government, then part of electing it is directing it on what you want it to do. So if you have an elected government, yes, I think you should stay on it. If it's not doing what you think you elected it to do, then you should raise a complaint and you should let it know.
Okay.
As for a self-created society, I think it's fine, really. If your government, once again, if your government isn't doing what you want, then you shouldn't be ruled by something that's tyrannical. So
Yeah.
if it's not doing what you want it to do, yeah, you should do
Okay.
something about it.
Okay. Let's see. Mitchell, why don't we let you get a word in if you're still with us?
Yeah, I was just gonna say that I think self-created societies are kind of just like what Giovanni was saying. They're not a bad idea, because the way I think about it is like most people like to stay within their own communities, and they like to solve the community's problems within the community, and they find that the best way to do that. And just considering how even within this country, you know, how diverse it could be, you know, the difference between like New England society and culture in New England, the difference between society and culture in like Georgia, for example, you know, they could be very, very different. So, you know, it's kind of like their right to be able to come together as like a community and talk about what works best and what doesn't work best for them. And they can go out and vote.
Yeah.
And even if they do get someone that they like elected, just kind of like what Giovanni was saying, they could still voice their concerns and opinions if that elected person starts doing things they don't like. And I think maybe in this case, seeing the Constitution and the First Amendment, maybe they thought they were just exercising that right, because it kind of does fall into the same category.
Okay. That's a good point. Yes, Paul?
Yeah, so once again, I'm just going to say something similar. I think that self-created societies are fine as long as they are within the peaceful petition of the government, and they don't like start threatening to burn down Pittsburgh and stuff. So I think in this case, the self-created societies went a little far, like especially when they were violent against like tax collectors and stuff. Then I think it starts to infringe upon their like right to exist. But as long as they're just like asserting their opinions and petitioning the government or complaining, I think they're fine.
Okay. Okay. Reasonable enough. By the way, in its response to Washington's message, the Senate, which is controlled by the Federalists, praises Washington and also condemns these self-created societies. The House of Representatives, where a majority are not Federalists, praises the mobilized, alert, and informed citizens of the United States. So you have the two different houses representing kind of different ideas here. And the House of Representatives seems more in line with what Mitchell, Paul, and Giovanni have been saying. The Senate more in line with what Washington and I were saying, that we don't like these self-created societies and people carping about things all the time. And the societies, according to the House of Representatives, and by the way, the House's response to Washington was again drafted by James Madison. It shows that the citizens are enlightened and citizens are able to make their own judgment, that the citizens really do govern here. You see, actually, what you really see in this, it's not just the case of whiskey, the whiskey tax. We don't like the whiskey tax. We do like the whiskey tax. It's really different views of how the government should work and what it should be doing. On the one hand, you have the Washington administration saying, you know, once you've elected the government, you should get out of its way and let it govern. On the other hand, you have this idea that the mobilized citizenry should be telling the government what to do. There's another kind of episode about this that it kind of illustrates this. It involves actually a treaty with Morocco, and the Washington administration had negotiated a new treaty with Morocco and sends a bunch of documents to actually asks for the Congress to ratify the treaty. And in the House of Representatives, there is a call that Washington needs to produce all of the documents pertaining to the negotiation, including things that the American negotiator had written about conversations he had with, I mean, they wanted to see everything. And they asked, how can the people's representatives govern if they don't have all of the information needed to make a judgment? How can people make an informed decision if information is suppressed? By the way, the person really leading the call for the executive to turn over all these documents is James Madison. And in his response, President Washington says, well, I was at the Constitutional Convention, and I don't remember this being discussed, that the executive has to turn over to the Congress every document. Plus, it would really be a bad thing for diplomacy if the House of Representatives is getting a hand on every document that comes into the executive branch. And so you have here two different ideas. It's not just about whether the executive has to turn over everything to the House of Representatives. And typically, we take a position on this depending on whether we like the executive or the House more whenever it's come up in the course of our history. You have the House of Representatives saying, how can the people govern themselves? How can you have self-government if people are kept in the dark? Then you have the Washington administration, and actually one member of Congress who is a supporter of the Washington administration saying the people do have a right to govern themselves, but they also have a right to be governed well. And that means that sometimes you withhold documents that are going to upset international affairs. So you have this argument going on about the nature of government and the lines in government at the same time as you have this bigger explosion in Europe of the French Revolution, which is bringing up all of these issues about governmental power and the construction of government. And how can you construct a government? And remember, there is some familiarity in the United States with these ideas of, elect members of a legislature, you elect an executive, but a system like this is new. And there's a sense on the part of Washington as to how fragile it is. And the things happening in France are really exacerbating that sense of fragility. Now, as this is happening, you do see two different political alliances forming. And you have the supporters of the Washington administration, mainly being, I don't want to categorize people by class, but, merchants, people engaged in foreign trade, and so on. On the other side, you have supporters of the Democratic Republicans, urban artisans, frontiersmen. These are the ones forming the self-created societies, but you also have some in the frontier of Virginia, or opposition to Washington among some Virginia planters. Washington himself is a Virginia planter, but you do have kind of political alliances forming. Now, remember, at this time, members of each of these kind of differing groups would see political parties themselves as a bad thing and something to be avoided, and wouldn't consider that the kind of group they are in is a political party. Instead, they will think the other side are people who are dominated by a will to power, and really that's an illegitimate coalition, the same way Washington called the self-created societies kind of illegitimate things. I know this is a fairly complicated thing, because what we see happening is the formation of political parties by people who believe political parties are a bad thing and are dangerous and inimical to liberty. On the other hand, we are creating these political parties and denying that that's what we're doing. And the leaders of each political party are foremost in denying that what they're doing is creating political parties. Samuel Johnson, who wrote the first dictionary of the English language, in it, he defines the two English political parties this way. The Tories, he said, are the upholders of our traditions, the venerators of our Constitution, and supporters of our established church. The Whigs, he calls a faction, and no one wants to be part of a political faction. So you have a denial that what we're doing is creating factions at the very same time that that's what we're doing. And as this is happening, James Madison actually wrote an essay for the press on parties. And Madison becomes one of the first of these people to see that political parties may be an essential thing here. And Madison pointed out that there always had been political parties, even though we didn't like to think about them this way. At the time of the Revolution, there were essentially two national political coalitions, the supporters of independence and the opponents of independence. And then, of course, the supporters win, and the opponents either go into exile or become supporters. And then you had this period when there were state political factions. You know, there weren't any kind of overriding issues nationally, but you had in each state these political alliances. And then in 1787-88, you have a new national political alliance formed among the supporters of the Constitution and the opponents of the Constitution. And this did form these national political alliances. And then that kind of ended with the election of the ratification of the Constitution, no longer a reason for people to go around saying, I'm a supporter of the Constitution or I'm an opponent, because the Constitution was ratified. So you had the creation of this system of government. And then what you saw happening with with Hamilton's economic program, you have a division again into factions among the supporters of the bank, the assumption of the state debts, the excise tax, and the opponents of these things. And these two factions are really colored also by their responses to the French Revolution. The supporters of Franklin's plan tended to be, like Trevor, lukewarm or against the French Revolution. The opponents of Hamilton's plan tended to like the French Revolution. So you have these emerging political divisions or alliances, an ideological cleavage happening over very serious issues about the nature of the federal government and the nature of federal power. And it's an argument that's going to continue over the next 7 or 8 years. So it's an argument we'll have to carry on next time, and we'll have one of the quizzes first, where we'll probably ask you about some of these issues and what's going on with these political divisions. And then we'll talk more about these political divisions in the 1790s. Okay, so that's what's on our agenda for Wednesday, and I will see you all then.
Have a nice day, Professor.
You too, Helen.
Professor, have a
Take
good
care.
day.
Good to see you.
Professor,
Yes.
I have a question.
Okay.
So I didn't know that the rough draft was due today, because when I was looking at the syllabus, it didn't say anything like specifically